Is David McCarricker. You're listening to Why Left.
So today on Why Left, we're going to talk about the concept of society. What is society? Where does this idea come from? And I think that one of the things that often gets left out when we talk about society is its roots in Roman political theory. Because the Romans have a distinction between civil and social relations. Civil relations is relations among citizens. Social relations, however, is something more nebulous. The old Latin term societas has to do with associates who are united in some way for a common purpose, but not members of the same polity, not citizens of the same political entity. And the term was frequently used in the Roman Republic to describe the status of the allied cities in Italy. So in the Middle Republic, you had a set of Italian cities. The members of these cities did not possess Roman citizenship, but these cities nonetheless had an association with Rome. And this can be translated as ally, but I think it misses some of what's going on because these cities are, in some sense, united with Rome, but not in a fully political way. And this idea that you can have relations with people that fall short of the political, but are certainly more than war. This kind of middle space for relationality is what the social is principally concerned with. And indeed, you can have social relations with people who come from a different class than you, which in an ancient city or state would have perhaps been excluded from citizenship. So a Roman citizen could have social relations with a person who lives in Rome but doesn't have citizenship. And that would still be a meaningful kind of relationship, but it would be very, very firmly recognized by the Romans as something different from civil relations.
Mm.
When Adam Smith uses the term society, he uses it to describe, and this is much later on, we're now jumping all the way ahead to the 18th century and to the Enlightenment. He uses it to describe a condition in which the division of labor has set in. So people are doing different jobs, performing different roles, and therefore acquiring highly specialized and divergent skills. Some people are doctors, and some people are farmers, and some people make cloth, and some people make steel, and so on and so forth. And these people have relations with each other that are social relations. They all become, for Smith, merchants. They all engage in trade with each other. And because they're engaging in trade with each other, this becomes the basis for them to have a conversation, an ongoing conversation with each other, which can be the basis for something. But this conversation is occurring through their trade rather than through their having established civil relations. And this makes them very different from ancient citizens who come together to discuss a shared political project, right? These are instead merchants, each of whom has their own interest, who are often negotiating with each other, hoping to get the upper hand in the transactions that they stage, but who nonetheless have some common concerns because they have to preserve the possibility of the trade. And so their common commitment is not to the city or to the state or to the polity, it's to the possibility of furthering the trade itself. It's to the possibility of further commercial relations. And so it's for this reason that Smith describes this as commercial society, associates united by their commercial activity. This is always looser than citizenship. It's always looser than political ties. And yet in modern political theory, it becomes this very strong bond. It's framed as something which is just as strong as, if not perhaps stronger than, the citizenship tie eventually. So, yeah, this is a curious thing. In antiquity, where you have these very firmly distinct and different classes, it's not obvious that everybody's a citizen. So you have all these different kinds of relationships. But gradually
This.
we decided in modernity to go a different direction.
Hold on, hold on.
Yeah.
Really quick before we go into it, I want to sort of introduce the the thing that we're doing here really quick because I know all my students are kind of waiting in the wings to introduce themselves if they're going to say anything in the live chat. So to the people who are live right now, there's 28 of you watching, and I wanted to let you all know that for the first time ever, we're doing this as a hybrid event, meaning that we are joined by my classroom here at Boise State for Sociology 101. And so, hello everybody, and go ahead and announce yourselves if you want to in the live chat. You can wave hi or spam the time energy emojis or whatever it is. Yeah, there we go. We've got Carson in the chat. And then we got Spencer, a TU person, saying hello, students. Um, a quick little thing about this for Why Left listeners. Uh, Benjamin already met these students, or at least most of them. I don't know, a couple Thursdays ago. It was brief. Some of them might not remember. Some of them were not present. And so I do want to really quickly just, I know we're in the middle of getting into the difference between the socius and the polity here, but let's take a quick step back. And I just want to say, this is Benjamin Studebaker, and we're on Why Left. And Why Left is a podcast where I basically talk about politics with Benjamin. And the question is, why? Why is he a leftist? Or why do people who want to change the world think that the solutions have to come from the left? Right? That's kind of my question. But we tend to focus on specific topics like this one. And so the listener base online is all obviously pretty familiar with him and his work, but I thought I would at least hold up the books here so you can all see that these are a couple of books that Benjamin has published over the last few years. The first in my left hand here is The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. And the one in my right hand is called Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. And that's the one that just came out in November. And he's currently going all over the world, giving talks about it for conferences and classrooms and podcasts and stuff like that. But anyway, so that's Benjamin, and he's someone who, uh, after he got his PhD at Cambridge, and after teaching political theory for a while, he's looking at the different places that he might work to continue his academic career. And for right now, he's like, I don't know about these options. So what he's doing is he's doing stuff at Theory Underground. He has a course that he's teaching called 12 Political Thinkers, and he has an ongoing seminar once per month where he can talk about whatever he's working on. Anything you would like to say to the class here, Benjamin?
Thanks for interrupting me, Dave. I didn't realize that I didn't get introduced during the time that you were on mute taking the role. I thought that that happened at that point. So thanks for stopping me from just talking about society as if we were on stream
Yeah,
for the whole
yeah,
hour, which I definitely, could have done.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. And folks, we'll be ending this episode with enough time for you to ask questions on the microphone, partially on stream, partially off stream after class. So if you stick around, you'll be able to ask questions. And you might want to because there will be questions on the next quiz related to some of the finer points that he's going to make on this episode. Yeah. Any questions about that before we proceed? No? Sure. All right, sweet. Okay, so like, let me see if I was following you right, Benjamin. We're talking about the conception of society itself. It's something that came about at a specific historical point. It's not the same thing as a political body of people. It's something that exists between politics and war. And Adam Smith thinks about it through the division of labor, the fact that people are engaged in trade. which obviously opens up a sort of question about, well, are we in a society? And if we are in a society, if we think about it the way the father of capitalism was thinking about it, then are we not a part of a global society? Right. And the tie into class last week when I said that the honors college at Boise State University doesn't care about child slavery. My point was we're part of a global society. They have all these special topics and they do the whole privilege walk, but it's all first world privilege that they care about. They don't think about the global system that requires our military interventions and constant enforcement to maintain, right? So I think that's kind of a direct tie-in to what we're doing here. This zooming out and taking a more historical approach to the development of how we think about society.
Yeah, yeah. So on the one hand, if you were to say, do we have society here and where do we have it? You could say that we have it all over the world because we have a World Trade Organization that people all over the world, even if they're in authoritarian states, even if they're in states that ostensibly our government frames as potentially hostile to us, are nonetheless participating in. China is in the World Trade Organization with the United States. And that means that there is social relations of a kind that goes on between you and people in very far-flung places, people who don't speak the same languages that you speak, people who don't have the same religious beliefs, people that you might think of yourself as having nothing in common with or even being enemies with. In one sense, you have society with these people. But in another different sense, maybe we don't even have society internally within the United States. And so this is to do with this question of, does society provide the kind of basis for politics that theorists like Adam Smith thought it might potentially provide? So for the Romans, what the citizens have in common is that they've got a shared body of knowledge, and they are able to have a continuous conversation about these things that they know. So there's an epistemic dimension to their civil relations. They're engaged in a common project of trying to know what's good for the city or what's good for the republic. And they're in dialogue with each other, trying to figure this out, trying to sort it out. And sometimes they disagree, but they have a civil discussion that is oriented toward the same knowledge object, which is the good of the city or the good of the republic. And the reason that they think people can be citizens, if they think they can be, is they think that these people have the capacity to participate effectively in that discussion. And if the Romans don't think a person has the capacity to participate effectively, then they're excluded from citizenship. They're given some other kind of status. It might be possible to have social relations with them. It might be the case that they're treated as an enemy, as a hostile. Or it might be the case that they are treated as a slave even. So there's very sharp differentiation, and this is differentiation which is ostensibly to do with, are you actually able to contribute, or are you thought to be able to contribute to this discussion about what's good for the republic? Now, Smith proposes that actually, if you're engaged in trade with people, based on the different kinds of economic roles that you perform, you do have some kind of meaningful knowledge, which could be pooled together in a way that is analogous, right? If you're a bunch of people who engage in trade with each other, you can talk about the trade and the conditions of the trade and have a discussion about the trade, which has a kind of common knowledge referential object, which is to know, what is necessary for good circulation of goods. And by having this sustained social discussion over time, you could produce a kind of state, a kind of polity, which is based on this, which would be different and distinct from a kind of polity which is framed around trying to advance the interests of a republic. And it's in this sense that liberalism is quite sharply different from, say, republicanism. And when I use the term republicanism here, I'm using it with a small r to refer to a tradition of republicanism that's very old. It goes back to notions of the Roman Republic or the republics of the Italian Renaissance or the republics of ancient Greece. So we're thinking here about people like Cicero or Machiavelli, not the Republican Party in the contemporary American sense, at least not necessarily. So this quite sharp distinction, who has knowledge and what kind of knowledge is necessary, relevant, or important is very key here. But I think one of the things people forget when they use terms like civil or social is that we're talking about people who are meant to be able to share in a pursuit of a kind of knowledge. They have a common epistemic project, and this epistemic project is oriented toward knowing the good of something, whether it's of the republic or of the commercial system, of the market system. There's some object that they're oriented toward. And if you're in a situation where you are engaging in trade with people, but they're not able to participate in a discussion about a common object, or if there's major, major disputes about which object, if any object, they have in common, then it might be less plausible to describe what they have as civil or social relations. Indeed, you might get to a point where there's a lot of talking going on, but it doesn't seem like it's very sociable or civil talk. It doesn't seem to be actually concerned with the objects that Smith would posit we ought to be socially concerned with, or that the Romans would posit we ought to be civilly concerned with. And at this point, even though you're speaking in English, and even though you're trading with people, and even though you might have the citizenship of the same state nominally in legal terms, you might not actually be participating in a conversation that would be recognizable from within either of those paradigms. So when we talk about does society exist, there are these very different and distinct senses in which we could be speaking. For some people, as long as the trade is still going on, it will be framed as if society exists. And in that sense, we do have a global society. And yet at the same time, it seems difficult to argue that we, in our practical day-to-day life, are engaged in the kind of conversation about the economy that a group of merchants in the 1700s might engage in, or a group of people, not just merchants, but people in different parts of the economy, if they came to a marketplace and talked about their business and their affairs, we don't engage in quite the same kind of conversation. A lot of our conversations are about being employed, as opposed to being an independent craftsman, as opposed to being someone who has a body of knowledge about something. And so one of the questions that gets raised is if you are caught in employment, are you able to have knowledge about something, whether that's commercial relations or whether that's political relations? Are you engaged in a kind of discussion that would enable you to participate on equal terms in something like that? And then at the same time, we've also had in more contemporary times a lot of doubt about whether you can have knowledge about these things. Is there really such a thing as a republic that you can know the good of? What does it mean to talk about the good of a republic? Isn't that a bunch of abstract ideology? And what about talking about the good of trade or good commerce or the good of the market? Isn't this also a different kind of ideology and a different kind of just a language that's used to boss people around and tell them what to do? So there's all kinds of doubts about whether civil or social relations are even valuable or important anymore, or whether these are even concepts we should use or ways in which we should talk. But then there's a question of what are we doing together? If we're not talking about some common good of a particular political body, and we're not talking about what's necessary for markets to operate well, what are we talking about? And on what basis do we think we're part of the same conversation? And this is where, Dave, you bring in an idea that I think is interesting and that we should talk about a bit, the post-class fractured mass.
Right. Right. And so I just added to the whiteboard for everybody the distinction here between two kinds of common objects, and is this all right to say this? Objectives? Could we just say like two common objectives? One being trade, right? So people brought together for trade. This is the Adam Smithian way of thinking about it, as opposed to the good of society, the good of the republic. And in this more classical sense of republic, that of course it seems like the GOP in the United States is like borrowing some of that meaning from, right? They'll say it's not a democracy, it's a republic. If you ever talk to a Republican, they'll say that it's not a democracy. It was meant to be a republic, or a
You could
democratic.
almost say the good of the polity versus the good of society, associating trade with social relations, with commercial society, right? If we say that society is specifically commercial society in that Smithian sense, then it would be society versus politics,
I like that. Yeah. So
or
society,
liberalism versus republicanism.
so polity,
Yeah,
liberalism versus.
versus republicanism. Yeah. Historically understood, not as they would be colloquially used in contemporary American political discourse. The terms have become very confused
I mean,
in recent times.
part of me wants to just say that it is. I mean, well, okay, so then so if it's confused, what would a person say to, for instance, like let's just look at the distinction I made. So trade versus the good, society versus the polity, liberalism versus republicanism. It does, just at a knee-jerk level, seem like Democrats care about the social, um, to the point where they get called socialists by Republicans, right? They care about the collective and the social in a way where it's just like, well, each individual is part of the demos, the democracy, right? Or at least should be. And so they care a lot about equality, right? There's an approach to equality that they emphasize. Whereas Republicans are going to say, I guess I don't know. It seems like they still borrow off of these meanings a little bit. I don't know.
A little bit. The Democrats invoke the concept of the demos, which comes from ancient Athens, which is a very old Republican concept of a body of citizens that includes people who have less property than would have been the case in other Greek city-states where the property barrier to citizenship was higher. But the reason that the Athenians extended that citizenship was not because they were committed to giving it to everybody that they had social relations with or that they traded with. It was because those citizens were rowers in their navy. The Athenian navy was powered by these triremes, by these ships that had many, many rows of oars. And so you needed these tough, strong guys to row these oars. And therefore, you needed a lot more of your population to be fighting. In other Greek city-states, the bulk of the military was hoplites, guys with spears and shields and helmets, and they had to purchase their own equipment. So they had to have more property. But a rower doesn't need to purchase any of his equipment. His trireme is supplied by some rich person in the city who gives the Athenian navy a trireme. And then a lot of these relatively poor people in Athens work as rowers on the trireme. They demand, however, as a condition of their rowing, that they be allowed to vote on when they row and where they row and who they fight. And this is what causes the Athenians to extend the citizenship to them. Athens creates a Delian League of allied cities with which Athens has social relations, commercial relations, but those other cities are never given Athenian citizenship. The people who live in them are never incorporated into Athens. And in
Mm.
part as a consequence of this, they bear resentments toward Athens and are not necessarily willing to cooperate with Athens over the long term. This was also the case, by the way, with the social cities, the cities in Italy that had social relations with Rome. They were bitter about the fact that they didn't enjoy civil relations with the people in Rome, that they weren't included as citizens. And this led to a major conflict called the Social War. And the thing that is so critical about this is that it's called a social war rather than a civil war, because it was not a war among citizens as the Romans understood it. It was a war among people who had social relations with each other. And in some sense, many of the interstate wars that we now fight, or that we have fought in recent centuries, could be classified as social wars, wars among people who trade with each other and do have social relations with each other, but are not part of the same polity and so don't recognize each other as fellow citizens. This kind of social war is a war which is in part over the terms of the social relations rather than two bodies of people who want to destroy each other utterly. The parties in a social war want to rearrange the relationship. The fight is because they're not able to get the relationship they want simply by continuing to trade. At
Mm,
some point or other, if they want the trading relationship to change, if they want to have more say politically in the way in which the trading relationship is structured, then they have to go outside the bounds of it. And so when you're in a persistent situation where the social relations are not functional, this tends to lead people to step outside of what would seem to be the social relations and into the terrain of war. But when you
mm,
do this with the intent to reconstitute the relations on a potentially improved basis, you're not engaged in a kind of, uh, you know, extremely nasty attempt to destroy somebody else as a kind of enemy other. That's a very different kind of war. So the Romans make these distinctions. There are civil wars, wars among citizens, social wars, wars among people who have social relations and who intend to continue to have those social relations, and then wars among hostes, among hostiles, people who actually want to destroy each other and take each other's stuff and enslave each other, for whom that's the object.
mm. Okay, and so then that is a nice little segue back into what you raised. And so the post-class fractured mass, who remembers that term here? How many of you remember that term? How many of you feel comfortable and ready to write about it next time there's a quiz? None. Nobody? Good. Good. Me either. Otherwise, I would have written the book already. But I'll give a quick little sketch of it. So I said that this week we would talk a little bit about the professional managerial class. Uh, we're more like preparing to talk about it next week. So I'm going to plant some basic seeds for thinking about it. And the best way to think about it is to think about the good old two class approach, which was sort of being riffed off of by Bernie Sanders and before him, Occupy Wall Street. And so maybe you've heard, we are the 99%, or it's 90, it's a movement that is against the 1%, right? Where 0.5% of Americans own, what is it? It's more than 50% of the wealth in the country, right? So this is seen as an injustice that people don't want to live with, right? In a system where you go bankrupt because you have a naturally occurring illness, right? In a society where treatable illnesses that would be taken care of in other countries kill your parents, right? This is, or your child, right? People get angry about it. And that's understandable to the point where when Luigi Mangione iced the CEO of United Health a couple months ago, hands up if you remember that. Okay. Some of you don't know about that? Hands up if you don't know about that. Oh my God. There's like 5 people who don't know about that. Okay, well,
What
we did
percentage of that is the total for people online?
5 out of 20.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was pretty viral, actually, and so more of you knew about the Musk thing, the Sig Heil. More of you knew about that than Luigi Mangione. But most of you knew about Mangione, right? So he walked up behind the United Health CEO when he was walking through the city, and he pulled out a pistol and he shot him, and shot him again. And the bullets were engraved with what? What was it, Benjamin? Do you remember? Like deny, delay, deny. Yeah. Deny, defund, depose. You're on a watch list now because you knew that. Yeah. I mean, we're all on watch lists now because of Mangione, and everybody was memeing about it. Everybody made light of it. Not everybody made light of it, but a lot of people made light of it. If you went on Facebook for like 2 months, there were memes popping up of people making fake alibis for Luigi, saying at that time on that day he was with them, and so that they'll Photoshop pictures of him into pictures with and so Mangione became kind of like this folk hero on the internet for some people, and of course for some people that's just gruesome because uh, what was his name? Was it Brian Thompson? Brian Thompson, the CEO, he's a human being. He's just working a job. He's got a family. How can we make light of the situation? For people who do make light of the situation, they'll just say, well, this guy was the CEO of the fourth richest company in the world underneath Amazon and Google, right? And Elon. Like this is but he's the one no one knew about. Everyone knows about Bezos, everyone knows about Musk, but Brian Thompson was just flying under the radar. And unlike Bezos and Musk, who still have questionable sources of wealth or power and prestige, Thompson gets it, and he gets rich by denying and delaying life-saving health coverage for people. So you've been paying for your health insurance and you expect that you'll be taken care of when you get sick. And then you get sick, and then instead of getting the help that you need, the insurance company is like, oh, well, sign this and talk to these people and do that and do that. And this is the delay tactic, right? These companies get rich by delaying providing life-saving coverage, right? This is a unique thing in human history. These kinds of companies did not always exist, right? And so we're the wealthiest country in human history, and we have the worst healthcare of any developed country, right? Or at least relatively speaking, given that context. So this has revived a bit of class thinking, right? This has revived a bit of thinking about society in class terms. There are those who are not worried about getting sick, who are not worried about calling an ambulance, and there are those who are like, no, I would do almost anything before I got into an ambulance, right? I would do almost anything, and I'm one of those people, right? I have no, I will take an Uber, thank you very much. I do not need their a thousands of dollar bill, to put me into debt and bankrupt me. And so class is what we're getting at with this distinction between those who have access to quality health coverage and those who do not have access, right? We all live in a society, or do we? Some of us are able to access the riches of a developed country, but others who are within this supposed society are not able to access those goods. And the traditional approach was to say there's two classes. There are the owners and there are the workers. Or in the more French uh, phrasing, right? I think you guys might remember this one. There is the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, right? The bourgeoisie being the business class, the capitalists, and the proletariat being the industrial army, the people who work the machine or the machines in the factories. To say we're post-class in the way that we use this term is not to say that class does not exist. It's to say we're post two classes, right? That the middle class is a much more complicated modern or contemporary development. And that what we're getting at is the rise of the educated elite. And it's hard to think of ourselves as elite, I think, especially at Boise State. Nobody who's ever gone to Boise State ever thought they were going to be president of the United States, right? This is not an elite institution. This is like high school 2.0, right? This is not uh, seen as a competitor with Reed, which is 6 hours away, right? And it's definitely not seen as a competitor with Berkeley or Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Oxford or Cambridge. And so those are elite institutions, right? The people who are there, they rule the world. Or at least if they don't rule it, they manage it, right? But we will be like miniature them, right? That's when I look at your guys' responses to the first couple of weeks questionnaires that I've had you answer. When you talk about your 10-year plans and where you see yourselves in the future, what we're getting at is your position in the relations of production and what seems plausible to you from where you are today and where you expect you'll end up then, right? And for most of you, it's in some kind of a profession or managerial position, right? And so in that sense, we're still professional or managerial material, right? So obviously we're not as elite as somebody who might come from such a prestigious institution, say, but uh, we we fill a certain role. We fulfill a certain societal function, right? And so what is that function? I do plan on talking about it a lot more next week, but for right now, the PMC, and I would be on the whiteboard and I'd put this up on the board. And so it's definitely something you'll be wanting to think about and take some notes about here. But basically, it is meant to be a class of people that mediates between regular workers and the people who actually own everything, right? So you don't own the capital, but you work for the capital that rules the world. That's the first point about the PMC. Before I turn it over to the fractured mass side, we're going to take a question from Carlo here, and then Benjamin, I'll ask you if there's anything you'd like to add to the PMC note, because yeah, we can come back to it for now, but I'll really quick check. Yeah. The professional managerial class. Yeah, repeating the definition. I said it plays a mediating role between the lower class and the upper class. Yeah. And then anything you would like to add to that before we move into the fractured mass part of this, Benjamin?
Yeah, one of the things to bear in mind is that while there has always been a certain number of people who play some kind of mediating role, some number of bureaucrats or civil servants or people in ancient states that occupy positions in between the high elites and the rest of the structure. The percentage of people who get university degrees in the United States has expanded extraordinarily rapidly in a relatively short span of time historically. If you go back to 1950, 1960, you're talking about maybe 5% of the population getting any kind of undergraduate degree at all. And 40 years ago, in the 70s and the 80s, there was all this talk of what they used to describe as the 80-20 divide. So this idea that 20% of the population was college educated and was becoming increasingly different from the 80% that were not. And that this was having all kinds of effects, because by the time you get to 20% of the population having a college degree, it's almost like they have a different culture from that other 80%. And it's a large enough percentage that these people can start to think, hey, maybe our culture is the future. Maybe we could even build a politics on the basis of what we have in common. And this created major divisions in the 70s and 80s in political parties. It produced, theories, social and political theories that were grounded on the idea that perhaps there was a new class that was coming into being. You even saw some of this in the 40s and 50s and 60s from theorists who were thinking ahead about what might happen in the years to come. Today, it's not 80-20, it's about 60-40. About 40% of the population of the United States now gets a college degree. And this is a percentage that is moving. When I was a kid, it was much closer to 80-20 than 60-40. I'm just 32. I'm not that old. So, and there's still a graduate premium. There's still an advantage that you get, even just in terms of income in going to school. And so there's every reason to think that even as this premium declines a bit, it's smaller than it used to be, we could still see this percentage grow some more over the course of even the next 10 years. It could be the case that in 2035, it's 50-50.
Mm.
It's not outside the realm of possibility. So then, a real question is opened up here. Does going to college make you different? Because if it does, then are we in two different discussions? And if we're in two different discussions, do we have social relations? Or do we have something different from that? Are we regarding the people who don't go to school as our equals in some sense? Or are they people we don't really interact with? If they're people we don't really interact with, are we engaged in a common knowledge project with them, aiming at anything, any particular goal? Or are we just studying them like a kind of Oriental other, like they're indigenous people in some far-flung corner of the world? This is what used to go on in those European empires. The universities would fund social scientists to go and figure out what's going on with those people out in Bengal. Why are they so hard to manage? What's going on in the Congo? What can we learn about how people interact there so that we can manage them better? When you barely have any kind of interaction, you start creating professional interpreters whose job is to use their social science training to figure out what's going on with people that you don't really have relations with, people that you're struggling to classify. Are these people who could be fellow citizens? Are they people we can have social relations with? Or should we regard them as strange, hostile people, strange, potentially hostile people that we can't trust?
Like I think of the way that people talked about truckers during 2020, right? Uh, are we in relation to truckers? Right? Like we have that overhead on the projector sometimes here in class that shows different people at different points in the relations of production, and the photo of the trucker hugging his two kids goodbye, and they're crying because he's going on the road for a couple of months. If he can't be with his children during formative times of their life because he has to make sure that we get our toilet paper at the grocery store, say, is that person in society with us? Do you think that he feels like he's in society with us if he never comes into contact with college educated people and he knows that his children don't have as good opportunities as we do? Right? There's these kinds of tensions that give rise to resentment. And I call them objective sources of resentment. Right? There's a popular liberal approach that says, oh no, it's because of the populists like Trump and Rush Limbaugh, and maybe even they'll go a little bit like, oh, Joe Rogan counts or whatever. And they'll say that those people stir up resentment. And what I'm saying is then potentially controversial, because I'm saying, no, there are objective sources of resentment. And certain people step in to try to fan the flames of those resentments or direct them towards their projects. right? Trump would be, in that case, if I'm correct, there are objective sources of resentment, and instead of addressing them head on, he fans the flames of that resentment, but directs it towards, say, immigration or Democrats or what have you, right? So I guess the last thing to say about the PMC side of things is that whether it counts as a class or as a caste or as just some grouping, that all comes down to how we define those words. And so for now, I use the word class only loosely because we would have to get into a whole discussion of how Marx defined class versus how Weber defines class. And I would also want to bring in Barbara and John Ehrenreich in their piece from Radical America 1972 called The Professional Managerial Class. For the people on the internet who are big theory nerds about this kind of stuff, uh, slow down there. Slow down. They like to pick it apart before they read the piece. They like to pick it apart before they read the piece. And if you're a big theory nerd for this kind of stuff and you haven't read this piece, my students are going to know more than you do. Can you sleep with yourself at night if you critique things that you don't know and my students know more than you do? Come on, guys. You do this because you love it. Let this be the figurative kick in the pants to actually get after it. Go read it. It's freely available on the internet. Just look it up. In that piece, she says that what progressives at the turn of the last century realized was that it's cheaper to have a college educated person come into a workplace and mediate relations than it is to hire Pinkertons or an armed militia to come and beat the crap out of striking workers. In her book, Fear of Falling, Barbara Ehrenreich talks about, you know about that book?
No, I'm just.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. Well, you will. There's a section called The Ancient Antagonism. And in that section, she talks about how in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, 7 hours north of here, I was there yesterday. Yeah, I know, I traveled down yesterday. In Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, something like 30, 40 years ago, there were striking miners, not like little children. No, I mean like, hard hats, lights, pickaxes, miners, dwarves were based on these people. And they they were tired of the bad or dangerous conditions and the low pay. And so they said, no, we need to do something about this. You guys have to raise our pay, and you can't keep these unsafe conditions the way they are. And instead of addressing the concerns of the workers, they sent in an armed militia, and several of the striking workers got shot and died. This is in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, right? Typically, when we think about labor struggles, we're thinking a lot further back or further away. This is pretty close to home, and I grew up there. And that mine, oh man. You know how expensive it was shooting those workers? It was very expensive. You want to know why? Because two of them got together and had a couple beers. They were like, what are we going to do about this? This is messed up, man. They killed our brothers. So they got some dynamite, and they went over and they threw it down the mine shaft. And it killed some security guards, and it really messed things up for the mine. Two people can cause a lot of damage, right? Like Mangione killing Brian Thompson. Yeah, that's a lot of damage. But Brian Thompson's actually more replaceable than like a mine shaft. It's going to take a lot of work to build that back, right? You can just hire a new guy to replace Brian Thompson. A mine shaft, now we're talking about something else. And what Barbara Ehrenreich is getting at is that it was very expensive to have labor relations come out all the time in fights, right? And so, yeah, a lot cheaper to replace the advanced workers on the factory floor with college-educated people who would then mediate relationships. and try to get you to see, oh, we're all in this together, guys. You just have to work harder and get paid less. And don't worry, it's for your own best interests. You should smile more, right? That's what they're there to tell you. The fractured mass, so that's the PC side of the PCFM. The PC side is the post 2 class because of the PMC, whereas the fractured mass side has to do with geopolitical. Yeah, I see a lot of pens hitting paper. That's a good thing. Yeah, I want to keep track of these points. It's going to be 3 bullet points. Geopolitical fracturing, meaning that factories or industrial areas got relocated across the globe into different nations with different laws, right? So it's easier to exploit workers in Aguascalientes, Mexico, because they got shafted by NAFTA or other trade agreements, right? So the Nissan factory in Aguascalientes, I think they're getting paid something like $4 an hour, which is pretty good by Mexico standards. And I knew several people while I was there who were working at that factory, right? It's good compared to some of the other things, right? And why are they able to be paid so cheap? It's because of these trade deals, right? But it's not just trade deals and outsourcing labor to other parts of the world, right? It's going back to last week's lecture on the zone of interest. These people are invisible to us, meaning even if you are a factory worker, you don't tend to see other factory workers because they're in other parts of the world. So the proletariat is spread far and wide. It's kind of like the ghetto in Boise, Idaho. Do you all know where the ghetto is in Boise, Idaho? Everyone's shaking their head. That's because it's fractured. Instead of concentrating it in one place, it's broken up into trailer parks hidden behind the Shopko over there. I know there's still a Shopko. It's crazy. There's actually a Shopko on Broadway, and there's actually a trailer park off behind it, right? Or the one that I lived behind in Hayden, Idaho. You don't see it when you drive by. You have to go down a back alleyway. People getting into their homes have to drive through an alleyway, right? We hide poverty really well now because when people all see each other and they know their numbers, they organize. They say, hey, there's a lot of us. We can work together. But people who do social engineering and city organizing, they go, let's not put them all together. That makes it too easy for them. Well, the same principle is being applied to the proletariat. That's the first of the bullet points, the geopolitical fracturing. The next one is the medium, which is what we are calling the internet and the smartphones and the cables under the ocean and the satellites in the sky. We're talking about the medium, where all previous mediums have now combined. Television, radio, clocks, calendars, letters, notes, books. It's all here in the palm of my hand, right? This is the medium. But what is the fracturing effect of the medium? Do any of you remember? Any ideas? What's so fracturing about the medium today? Yeah. Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's about our niches. We all live in the niches now. We all think we're like that meme of the person at the party thinking they don't know that I'm into underwater basket weaving. They don't know that I collect stamps. They don't know that I'm a big shot in the world of whatever. I'm like one of the moderators on Stupid Poll on Reddit, right? We get our identity through this sort of secret, weird relation we have to the niches via the phones. The phones have a kaleidoscopic fracturing, splintering effect on us, right? So instead of seeing us as all the same, it helps us all think that we're very, 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 very different from one another, right? So Marshall McLuhan, the first real theorist of the medium, He was thinking about television mainly, but of course he thought about all media. And one of the things he was saying is this movement from books to television will make us all a part of a global village. That was very optimistic of him. And those who are getting the book Amusing Ourselves to Death as a part of this class, Neil Postman is a McLuhanite. He studies McLuhan. He's basically like a disciple of McLuhan, but he's not optimistic. Unlike McLuhan, he's like, man, this is not making us a global village. This is making us a global couch potato. This is making every important thing that happens mere entertainment, right? The medium itself turns the most serious things in the world into pure entertainment. Meaning Vietnam being televised. People say, see, this will be the end of war. This will unite us all. Yeah, well, outside of a handful of people that got activated, most people were made docile and passive because they were watching it and getting outraged by what they were seeing. But it, as the medium, coming through television, it makes people take in this sensational news as entertainment. It's very different. The smartphone has the same effect, obviously, but it also gives you the sense that you have a voice and that you can respond or talk back to the television, but you're siloed, like these people in the live chat, or you, if you are in the live chat right now, then you know you can talk back, but most people know that talking back in the live chat doesn't really mean anything, right? Some people really think, though, that turning on their phone and talking to TikTok and sharing their message with the world, that it really does go to the world. When in fact, it doesn't go to the world. It goes to the niches. Isolated niches, not to a society. Maybe a micro society of some sort. Maybe, of course, that'll bring us back to our question of what is society, right? All right. The last point, what did I say? We'll get into the other one next time, but at the level of our fundamental dispositions, we're also divided. So we're fractured geographically, we're fractured across the niches via the medium, and then we're also fractured at the level of our fundamental dispositions. So we'll get into that next time. We have a couple minutes here to close down, and you'll all get an opportunity, or at least one of you will get an opportunity to ask a question. But let's, at least on the live side. So for the 100 people who remain here on the live stream, the number just keeps going up. And then also for those who are here in the classroom, it's been really great to have you all here. And yeah, my main thing is when I'm asking, like, what is society? I'm thinking about the post-class fractured mass. And I'm thinking about how the word we is used very liberally by our representatives and by ourselves. People will say, oh, we were really bad to the natives. And I'm always like, who are you calling we here? I've never done shit to a native. What are you talking about? Oh, well, you're a white person. Oh, okay. So what's a white person? Right? People take these words and then they just say, we're all part of a thing. And I'm over here going, are we really part of a thing? What's the thing that we're a part of? Where did you get your category from? How did you define it? Who defined it? Whose interests are served by that definition? When did you internalize that definition? Why do you think of yourself as that category? These categories are not ideologically or politically neutral, and they do serve some people. I personally suspect they don't serve us very much at all. But who knows? Maybe they do. Benjamin, you get the floor for the last 5 minutes. Really? Yeah.
Yeah, as I am listening to many of these very interesting things that you're saying, I am thinking about how so often the function of the professional class and its mediation is to create an appearance of political or social relations where you don't really have that. You don't really have a conversation oriented at a common knowledge object. of either the political or social kind. What you have is a kind of pseudo conversation that has this appearance of being political or social, right? You post online, you're looking to socialize or you're looking to do politics online, but you're not actually able to engage in a debate, which then results in some kind of arriving at conclusions or learning of something at the level of the whole polity or the whole society. Instead, oftentimes, as the conversation goes on, we become just more upset and more reactive and less able to think about what's going on rather than more able. And yet, we often get a kind of recognition from this activity. And so this recognition makes it appear as if we have social relations with people or political relations with people because we're getting a response to the things we're saying of some kind. It's not as if we're total strangers. We don't see ourselves as hostiles with the people that are liking and following and commenting or that we're debating with online. And yet, we also don't seem to be engaged in a social or political project. Nevertheless, a lot of the function of the whole discussion is to create a sense that you can have this if you want it, even though it seems increasingly like these kinds of conversations are just no longer taking place. That what we are doing is a kind of talk that doesn't fit into an old-fashioned, Roman Republican, classification of types of relationships. Nevertheless, I do think it's helpful to think about those old Roman terms because the thing that the Romans were really good at was being precise about what actually is going on and being a little bit brutally honest about it. They wouldn't pretend that a conversation that they were having that was just a social conversation was a civil conversation. And they wouldn't pretend that a conversation with a stranger was social relations. We do tend to conflate these things together. And we do it in part because we don't want to think about them.
Yeah, it makes me think of Agamben and the concept of homo soccer, right? The this is a term developed by the Romans or specifically by Roman law. If they say that you are homo soccer, as opposed to say homo sapiens or other kinds of homo that there might have been at the time, I don't know. The homo soccer or soccer is the person who you can kill, but you cannot sacrifice. Anyone can kill them, but they can't be sacrificed, which means that their life is not sacred. The legal system was able to say that person, not only can you kill them, they're not sacred. So they had their sacred status just removed, right? Is that kind of what we're getting at by they were very precise and brutally honest in their precision? So social not equal to civil?
Yeah, they were not committed to the idea that we were all equal insofar as we are human. And because they weren't committed to this, they could speak in a very straightforward way about what particular people were actually entitled to, what political or social status they had. And political and social status are quite literal usages of the civil and the social as concepts. They could be straight up about this and it didn't bother them. They didn't have reservations about it in the way that we do. When we talk about these distinctions, there's always a normative sense that we have that these distinctions shouldn't exist. And because we don't want them to exist, we'll sometimes pretend they don't exist so as to feel better about the way that things are structured. But for them, it was not obvious that it was wrong to make these distinctions. And therefore, they didn't feel the need to pretend that they didn't exist in the way that we do. So sometimes studying civilizations, which is to use a term which comes directly from the Roman notion of the civil, from different points in history and in different places, allows you to have a different perspective. You don't have to adopt the normative attitude that the Romans had to different population groups or to different social or civil classes. You don't have to think like that normatively, but it may nonetheless be useful to you in understanding the kind of world that you're living in to be able to think in terms of the categories and to see them. This is something that people readily recognize in relation to race, for instance. Even if you don't think that you ought to view someone as a member of a racial group, it may nonetheless be necessary to understand what's going on, to be able to use that concept. And if you were to just refuse ever to use racial concepts, if you always avoided using them because they made you unhappy, this wouldn't necessarily allow you to understand things. It would make it kind of harder to talk about certain things that are going on. But people are much slower to apply that kind of logic to social or civil distinctions, to this question about what kind of relations do you have with another person. There we all want to pretend that we're all equal and we're all engaging in the same kind of conversation with everybody all the time. It's always the same.
I'm waving this microphone around because I'm in our last minute of time that you are to be here. I mean, you're all free to go pretty much in a minute, but does anyone have a question that's either burning for you personally or that you think might be good for us just to talk about for the sake of the episode, for the sake of clarity, for the sake of the audience, etc.? I see a couple people kind of thinking about it.
Give it a shot. I don't bite.
You don't bite. Here we go.
So is the PMC the same as the post-class fractured class that you were talking about at the beginning? Is that the same thing?
That's a great question. Yeah. No, so it's more like the PMC's nested within the broader concept of the PCFM. The PCFM would be it includes the fractured mass, but the PMC part is really addressing the post-class part of the PCFM. Yeah.
Yeah, Dave's PCFM has many different aspects to it, one of which is the emerging divide between professionals and traditional workers, but then also say the splitting of the workers into the many different countries that Dave mentioned. So there's also a geographic split, a spatial split.
Yeah. All right. Well, and so of course you're all free to go now. You can also hang around a little bit longer if you'd like. I did want to say something about your books. You should have ordered your book already. You can also get your books on Audible. I think most of them are available on Audible, if not all. Well, Classification Struggles is not, but yeah, you can email me questions. I'll see you all on Thursday. Just start your books though. There will be activities related to those books soon. And they're going to be awesome. I promise. And then people at Theory Underground, that list of books has been shared in my part of the forum underneath the base braid. And so if you want to be reading these books that we're all talking about, the list is there. Amusing Ourselves to Death, Weapons of Mass Instruction, Sociological Imagination, Invitation to Sociology, and Classification Struggles. Those are the main books that we're focusing on this semester. And TU people who are reading those books might be able to get grouped up with some people in my classes who are also reading those books for some very high level conversations. And with that, everybody here in the live chat, it was so great to have you all. We're about to cut this thing off. Thank you for being here for this multimedia interdisciplinary experiment. This is one of many that we're going to be doing over the next month or in the next month's time. Yeah.
Yeah, this is fun. It is interesting how it changes what you're doing to be doing a podcast, which is also in front of university undergraduates. It was not an ordinary undergraduate class, and it was not an ordinary podcast. It was something else. And this is the trouble, right? When we're having a different kind of conversation from the kinds that we're familiar with and that we can easily classify, instead of trying to describe what is the conversation we're actually having, we just pretend that it's some other kind of relations that
Exactly.
it may not be.
Right. Has the object that holds us together changed? Or do we even have an object anymore? That'll be
Are we doing
something for,
something else?
we're doing something else. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. We're not even going to roll a PSA on this one because I don't know how to do that from here. I think if I push this button on my phone, it's not going to work. I thought I had it, but I'm still working on remote access to my desktop. And so for now, thank you, everybody. Peace. And then as soon as I see myself waving the hat on the back end of YouTube Studio here, I'll hit the end stream button. There we go. Done. Very good. And then Benjamin, I'll be 1 second. I got to check in with a couple students.